Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Class 10, Conservative as the Culture Warrior, or what I've called in the syllabus, Counterculture. Today we'll be looking at two debates, one between William F. Buckley Jr., the founding editor of the National Review, and the African-American novelist and essayist James Baldwin, and between Phyllis Schlafly, the conservative activist, and Betty Friedan, feminist author of The Feminine Mystique. And we'll be looking at these two debates to think about how this agonism, this desire for conflict, and manifests itself in conservative politics, specifically around cultural issues. So questions of, in the case of Buckley and Baldwin, race, segregation, the lasting impacts of race, slavery, and Jim Crow segregation on the lives of African Americans. In the case of the debate between Schlafly and Friedan, we'll be looking at the kind of cultural areas around the equal rights amendment, so gender primarily. And so to kind of transition from last week when we were talking about this kind of like conservative view of the world as in a constant state of war, it's important to note that Nietzsche at least thought that this instinct was often sublimated. In a later book, Twilight of the Idols, he talks about the Greeks' strong instinct, their will to power. But he viewed that it said that the Greeks recognized that despite this, like these agonal instincts, despite this desire for conflict and violence, that they built institutions, one of which was the polis, and now these city-states eventually were in constant warfare with each other. But he also viewed their festivals and arts as ways to sublimate this desire for competition and conflict and glory into something that was healthy for the polis and something that wouldn't tear the community apart. And elsewhere in the same book, he writes about the spiritualization of hostility, the spiritualization of hostility and recognizing the value of having enemies. So not wanting to defeat your enemies in a kind of existential conflict that Schmidt describes, but preserving enemies because of this political benefit that you gain from having something to oppose. And so here we can think of the turn to the culture war as a way of sublimating this desire for conflict and violence into something that is less destructive, but yet preserves this desire to enhance and better oneself through conflict and competition against others. So today we'll be looking at Buckley's and Schlafly's critiques of the new social movements of the 60s and 70s, and connecting these arguments to the broader tradition of conservatism. So a little bit of background about William F. Buckley Jr. He was born into a Catholic family of his father was an oil developer stationed in Mexico, where his family lived while he was a child, Buckley Jr. He maintained his Catholicism throughout his life, often was critical of perceived anti-Catholic bias in journalism and in politics. During World War II, Buckley Jr. Served stateside in the Army. He earned the rank of second lieutenant while serving in Georgia and in Texas. He went on to pursue an undergraduate degree at Yale, where he studied political science, history, and economics. He graduated with honors in 1950. While at Yale, he was a member of the infamous secret society Skull and Bones and was a highly regarded member of Yale's debate team. His first book, published in 1951, God and Man at Yale, was written shortly after his graduation and offered one of the earliest critiques of the liberalism of higher education. He argued that it was imposing a leftist, atheist worldview on its students, using academic freedom to shield itself from criticism. And his biggest concern was his claim in the book that Yale was trying to force students to abandon their religion. And this book made him kind of a leading voice in the burgeoning conservative movement at the time. In 1960, Buckley helped form the Young Americans for Freedom, the YAF, which was guided by principles Buckley called the Sharon Statement. He also worked on various political campaigns, most famous including his older brother Jim Buckley, who captured a U.S. Senate seat in 1970 before being defeated by the Democrat Daniel Patrick Moynihan in 1976. In 1963 and 1964, Buckley mobilized support for the candidacy of Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, first for the Republican nomination against New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, and then for the presidency. And he used his magazine, The National Review, for mobilizing support for Goldwater. And much of Buckley's work was about defining conservative as much as it was defending conservatism. In the National Review, he sought to articulate what he viewed was a minority position, conservatism, in the American intellectual culture. Part of his project was to criticize and reject conservatives that he felt tarnished the brand, people like the reactionary John Birch Society, people like Ayn Rand. And while in the pages of the National Review, he defended a temporary segregation as a necessary evil before achieving a fully integrated South, he was critical of George Wallace, white supremacists, and anti-Semitism who associated with conservatism. So he tried to kind of balance this tightrope where he was not for full recognized and realized legal and social equality of blacks and whites in the South, but he was critical of the most kind of vehement forms of white supremacism. In 1955, Buckley founded the National Review as an isolated voice for conservatism in the media. In the kind of statement of intentions, he writes that the magazine will forthrightly oppose the prevailing trend of public opinion, will begin as a minority voice. He positions conservatism as the outsider, and this is very consistent with what we've been talking about with conservatism as this like lone brave voice willing to stand up to modernity. Explicitly, he says, it stands athwart history, yelling stop at a time when no one is inclined to do so or have much patience with those who so urge it. This very kind of reactionary response to modernity, to the like trends of the world. It promoted what's been called a fusionism conception of 20th century conservatism that fused together traditionalism, libertarianism, and anti-communism. So in the statement of principles, he talks about we are unapologetically libertarian when it comes to the scope of government. We are unapologetically traditionalists when it comes to critiquing scientific planning and utopianism. We are militantly and implacably anti-communist. We emphasize honesty and independence rather than conformity. And continuing this kind of agonistic way of thinking, he writes in this declaration of intentions that middle of the road, qua middle of the road, is politically, intellectually, and morally repugnant. And the world for Buckley is essentially a zero-sum conflict. He talks about the fight against growing government as the great social conflict of the era, argues that in the conflict against communism, coexistence is neither desirable nor possible. He also calls for a renewed partisan conflict and kind of against the post-war consensus of the 1950s, and for increased market competition. All this kind of pointing to this idea that he thinks that we can't kind of tamp down the inherent complex in competition in society, but we need to enhance it. The debate that you'll be watching this week was at the University of Cambridge Debating Society on February 18th, 1965. They debate the resolution, "The American Dream is at the expense of the Negro." And it was originally planned to be a debate between Baldwin and a Southern segregationist, but everyone that they reached out to debate Baldwin declined, and eventually they reached out to Buckley, and Buckley saw it as an opportunity kind of, publicly debate one of his rivals, one of his intellectual rivals, kind of use it as a way of promoting his own brand as well. Again, this kind of Nietzschean idea that like you seek out the strongest enemies and you prove yourself against them through this conflict. So we're going to talk about Schlafly and the ERA in just a second here, but go ahead and take a break if you need to. So Phyllis Schlafly was born to a Catholic family in St. Louis in 1924. During the Great Depression, her father was unemployed and her mother worked as both a librarian and a school teacher to keep Phyllis Schlafly and her sister in Catholic school. She went on to enroll at college at a young age and worked as a model to help support herself through college. She graduated PBK from Washington University in St. Louis and earned a master's in political science from Radcliffe College, which was the women's college associated with Harvard, which at the time was all male. And that was in 1945. She eventually, later in her life, earned a JD, a law degree from Washington University in St. Louis in 1978. Beginning in 1946, so soon after earning her master's, she began working as a researcher for the libertarian think tank, the American Enterprise Institute. And much of her early political involvement focused on the themes of anti-communism. She and her husband collaborated on the American Bar Association's report on communist tactics, strategy, and objectives that was published in 1957. And this was really kind of a theme of of her political activism throughout this kind of period of the 50s and early 60s, which was that the Republican Party was not being strong enough against communism, and her conservative activism was trying to, the conservative movement at the time was very much around the need to fight communism, the enemy of communism being taken more seriously. She began working on political campaigns in the 40s and 50s, supporting the election of Claude Bakewell to the House. She unsuccessfully ran for the House twice in downstate Illinois, losing by double digits each time. But she rose to prominence with the publication of her book, A Choice Not an Echo, a book in support of Goldwater's 1964 presidential campaign. In the book, she criticized the Republican Party of the 50s and 60s of accepting a globalist consensus with Democrats, not fighting hard enough against communism, similar tropes that we see today. And she rose to national prominence beyond the Republican Party with her activism to stop the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment at the state level. She formed Stop ERA and the Eagle Forum, organized numerous marches and campaigns to try to influence actions at the state legislatures to prevent enough states from ratifying the Equal Rights Amendment and getting to make it get passed. Many on the right credit her activism. Most historians point to the power of the insurance industry, which would have had to expensively expand its coverage to cover men and women's healthcare equally, and that lobbying power of the insurance industry ultimately underwrote much of the opposition at the state level. She also had maintained conservative social policy issues, spoken out against abortion, calling Roe the worst decision ever made by the Supreme Court, and opposed civil unions and marriages for same-sex couples. So in various writings, we can see this kind of very agonistic instincts that we for Schlafly. In A Choice Not an Echo, she writes that there's a very simple solution to what to do with the problem of the communism. Just stop helping the communists. The Soviet Empire would die of its own economic anemia if the democratic administrations didn't keep giving it massive blood transfusions. It's a very simple solution to the problem of peace and disarmament. It was given to us by the father of our country, her capitalization. The formula is as good today as when he said it. If we desire to secure peace, it must be known at all times we are ready for war. And again, that no compromise, anti-communism, the kind of heart of the movement here. She's very critical of feminism, especially after her beginning with her kind of movement against the ERA. In a newsletter in 1989, she describes the biggest defect of feminism is that it attempts to change or repeal human nature. Again, kind of similar tropes that we saw from like Burke and Oakeshott and de Meister. This kind of Enlightenment attempt to kind of reform human nature is unrealistic. She describes feminism as a radical restructuring of society, with government using its power to force feminist goals on all the rest of us. Again, like we've been talking about throughout, this kind of continuing trope of conservatism, that it's an all or nothing, that there's no room for compromise, that it's a very binary choice between the status quo or a revolutionary restructuring of society. And more recently, in 1995, she describes the anniversary of the United Nations as a cause for mourning. She calls it a Trojan horse that carries the enemy into our midst and lures Americans to ride under an alien insignia to fight and die away in faraway lands. Again, this critique of Enlightenment cosmopolitanism and globalism, instead viewing this idea that like the search for world peace, right? This very Schmittian idea that if we ever had world peace, it would be the end of politics. And a very similar defense of sovereignty here coming from Schlafly. So in the debate, we're watching Schlafly is debating Betty Friedan, author of The Feminine Mystique, which went a long way to kind of popularizing the tenets of feminism for a kind of broader audience, a non-academic audience. In 1973, Friedan and Schlafly debated at Illinois State University in front of a mostly pro-ERA crowd. At one point when they were debating whether or not why there are fewer women running for office. Schlafly said it's because they didn't want to run for office, that they would rather stay at home and have babies, in which Friedan, according to newspaper reports, we don't have a recording of the actual debate, called Schlafly a traitor to your sex and Aunt Tom, and said, I'd like to burn you at the stake. Unfortunately, the debate that we're watching is a little bit less dramatic. This is a 1976 debate on Good Morning America about the ratification efforts for the ERA. So some questions as you're watching and thinking about these debates. How do these arguments resonate with and depart from the conservative thinkers that we've studied? Since we're not really looking at texts and thinkers and philosophies here, but where do they line up? Where do they differ? And what are some of the examples of their agonism in these debates? Where do you see the kind of like agonistic approach to politics here? Are there any arguments that any of the four, Buckley, Baldwin, Schlafly, and Friedan, could have made that would have been persuasive to each other? Kind of thinking back to McIntyre and the irresolvability of moral arguments. And then finally, like, what's the value of engaging in these debates? If you're kind of engaging in a debate with someone who views you as a diametrically opposed worldview, where there's no real hope of convincing or persuading them, like, what is the value of this debate? What is the kind of, why should opponents to conservatives take the bait and engage in these debates, or should they not? So those are some questions to think about as we move forward. And as you watch these two debates, I hope that you enjoy kind of a break from the reading and the opportunity to kind of see some of these arguments and being kind of portrayed and realized in the public sphere. I look forward to chatting with you in discussion sections about how the kind of like agonism on display in these debates. So I will see you in class this week. Have a good rest of your day.